Okay, so hi everyone. I know some of you, not all of you, but nice to see everyone. Um, so thank you for coming. I know everyone has a busy schedule, so thank you for your interest and your participation in our first event for the semester. So this semester we've decided that we want to do more educational and advocacy work since those are really important aspects of community engagement. So we have the ability to do that, so we should. So we thought we'd kind of kick off the semester with a topic that's very relevant to the current moment and this past year, which is the eviction crisis during the pandemic. Am I echoing a little bit? I feel like I can hear it.
Too bad though.
Okay, let me. Okay. So a little bit background information about what we're talking about. So in August, it was estimated that around 30 to 40 million people in the US could be at risk for eviction in the next several months. And a lot of property owners who don't have the credit or financial ability to cover rent payments would be struggling to pay their mortgages and property taxes and maintain their properties. And there have been a bunch of different studies which have tried to quantify the effect of COVID-19 related job loss and economic hardship on renters' ability to pay rent during the pandemic. And the general conclusion has been kind of that, if conditions don't change, then a third or more of renter households could be at risk of eviction by the end of the year or so. And another important point is that communities of color are disproportionately rent burdened and at risk of eviction. And people of color are twice as likely to be renters, are disproportionately likely to be low income. And on top of that, the economic recession, along with job loss and wage loss, have all sort of magnified or kind of accelerated the existing housing crisis. And I think it was as of July of this year that it was about like 50 million Americans had filed for unemployment insurance. And, it's only been 3 months since July, but that number has probably increased by a lot. And already more than 20 million renters live in households that have suffered COVID-19 related job loss. And that's only been worsened by kind of expiration of pandemic unemployment insurance benefits. So, clearly there's so many different factors in play, and it's obviously like a multifaceted issue we're dealing with. So we have with us today Salman Kazarunian, who's going to be able to tell us more about it. So he's been a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center since 2012, and he primarily litigates housing discrimination cases. So after providing some context on the nature and the scale of this long-running eviction crisis in Connecticut, who bears the brunt of it, how it impacts families in the near and long term, Salman will discuss the ways in which the crisis has unfolded during the pandemic and how there's kind of been this patchwork of confusing state and federal protections that gives temporary comforts to some renters, but hundreds of thousands of others, which are disproportionately women and people of color, are facing imminent risk of having their lives uprooted. And he'll also talk about the work the center does in trying to help renters stay home. So yeah, you can take it away.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. Hopefully, since this is not a huge group, we can have a little bit of a dialogue. So if anybody has questions or comments, feel free to, I don't know what the best way to do this is. You could either, I guess, raise your hand with the little hand raise thing, or type it into the chat, and maybe someone could monitor the chat and read questions out. Yeah, that sounds okay. So as you heard, I'm a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. We're a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to ensuring that Connecticut residents can live in the housing of their choice, free from discrimination. And I'm going to give, as you heard, a little bit of context about the sort of normal housing crisis in Connecticut in a normal year. which in my opinion is a pretty severe crisis that leaves many people at imminent risk. Sorry, 1 second. And at some point during this, I would like to share my screen. I don't know if I have power authority to do that. I just thought I would let you know. Okay, sorry. Most poor families in the US spend over 50% of their income on housing costs. And about a quarter of low-income families spend over 70% of their income. Now, if you're spending 70% of your income month after month, year after year on rent and utilities, then you're one emergency away, you're one medical bill away, you're one sort of unforeseen circumstance away from not being able to pay that rent. There are subsidized and affordable housing options where there's government assistance available for certain types of housing projects or you can get a voucher that will allow renting on the private market using a subsidy assistance. But about a quarter of families that are qualified and eligible for that type of assistance actually get it because it's just insufficient. There isn't enough of it. There are long waiting lists, and that's if you're lucky enough to get on the waiting list. So under these conditions, it's clear why many families are unable to stay on top of those payments. And as these housing costs soar, of course, wages have flatlined for decades and recently have plummeted with massive job loss. But at the point at which a tenant, let's say you do have that unforeseen circumstance and you fall behind, at that point, most landlords think it's time to replace you with a new tenant. But to lawfully remove you, landlords need to go through the eviction process. They don't always do it lawfully. In Connecticut, I haven't seen as much of it, but I used to work in Tennessee, in rural Tennessee, where it was pretty commonplace to have lights shut off and a door removed or an air conditioner removed in the middle of summer to try to get the tenant to move out. That's very illegal everywhere, but I haven't seen a lot of it in Connecticut. So you need to go through this court process, file an eviction in court. In a typical year, about 20,000 households in Connecticut face eviction, have actual evictions filed in court against them. That's households, not people. These cases move through the court system very quickly, whereas a regular civil case, if you're sued for anything else, it would move. You'd have 30 days to file something in response to what so everything moves in 30-day increments. In eviction cases, it's 3-day increments. So things move pretty rapidly. You can go from having a case filed against you to being at trial in a matter of weeks, which actually is slower than some other states. But and tenants in Connecticut have opportunities to slow the process down that don't necessarily exist in other states. I'm happy to talk about the eviction process itself if folks have questions about it, but before we get into that, I'd like to talk a little bit about who those 20,000 families are. And Ananya did a really good job introducing this. But essentially, they're overwhelmingly people of color and women. Matthew Desmond is an author and sociologist who is credited with bringing this issue into focus a few years back when he published Evicted, which is a great book. I strongly recommend it. He observed that, quote, if incarceration had come to define the lives of men from impoverished Black neighborhoods, eviction was shaping the lives of women. Poor Black men were locked up. poor Black women were locked out. He collected information from courts about what evictions had been filed, and also did extensive surveys with households. He developed a methodology for estimating the races of the people who are named in eviction cases, based on where they live and based on their name, and came up with an analysis that showed pretty stark disparities pretty much wherever you look at it. And in, I want to say 2017 or so, we actually purchased from the Connecticut Judicial Department, we got a dump of their entire database and started looking at Connecticut eviction records ourselves to see if these trends hold true, and also to see what we could start to do about it. And we found that, in fact, actually, let me share my screen right now. I think this is as good a time as any. One sec. I'm going to share a map. Can everyone see this? Yeah? Well, I can't hear you, so I hope so.
Yeah.
All right, awesome. So this is Connecticut, the eviction data I just mentioned. Basically, we have it stored in a local copy of the judicial database, and we've run a number of analyses on it, but this is it just plugged into a Google map. And on the left, you'll see a list of the locations with the largest number of eviction filings over the selected time range. The time range I selected here is all of 2019. I wanted to show you what this looks like in a typical year. So let's zoom out and look at Connecticut as a whole. I mean, it looks like you might imagine once you know that people of color are significantly more likely to have evictions filed against them. So the evictions in Connecticut are concentrated in the urban centers in Hartford, Bridgeport. Looks like Waterbury's number 3, New Haven, New Britain, Stamford. Those areas in Connecticut. Connecticut's also one of the most segregated states in the country, if not the most segregated. I think we're up there with Mississippi, 1 and 2, in terms of school segregation. And that means that I think Hartford is 10 to 15% white. It's no more than 15% white. Overwhelmingly people of color in Hartford, and you see that's where the evictions also are. So the analysis is a little bit more sophisticated than that, because it looks at the likelihood of a Black person, sort of regardless of where they are, being evicted. So a comparable white person, if you look in a white census tract somewhere in, say, Holland or something, there might only be 2 or 3 evictions over the course of a year. But this process tries to estimate the likelihood that a person of a given race would be subjected to eviction. So Matt Desmond really spearheaded this, and his website currently is called the Eviction Lab, where they've actually created a national map of evictions from years ago. Like theirs is not current data in that map, but then they have a new sort of sub part of their website called a COVID tracker, which looks week to week at the evictions that are being filed in real time. They got their data for Connecticut. They look at Hartford and Bridgeport only, or the metropolitan areas for Hartford and Bridgeport. They got their data from us. I give them a data feed of evictions, but they apply their demographic analysis to it, and then look at sort of during COVID, they do a comparison of a typical year to what they're seeing in a given place in a given year. if you look at Eviction Lab's site now for their COVID tracker, you don't get a lot of useful or interesting info. And there is interesting information there about Connecticut, but you really need a lot of sort of context to be able to understand what some of those figures mean. Because right now, if you look at it, it looks like there aren't many evictions being filed, which is true, but we'll get into the reasons for that in a minute, and how long lasting we expect that to be. So let me zoom into Hartford now. And you can see, I don't know how well you all know Hartford geography, but you can see that even within a city, the evictions are not evenly distributed between neighborhoods. So you, like West End has relatively few evictions, and you know, there's 2 records there, not many. And then if you zoom out, you'll find in other neighborhoods in the North End and in places where you know, the white people are not concentrated, you'll find larger numbers of evictions. So the West End is I believe, in terms of like neighborhood demographics, the whitest neighborhood in Hartford. So now, those 20,000 cases, back to those 20,000 cases, I'm going to stop sharing this for a second and keep talking, but I'll share it again in a minute. As I said, these cases move quickly, and tenants typically are not represented by attorneys, while landlords are represented by attorneys. 80% of landlords in 2019 filed evictions with attorneys, 6% of tenants had attorneys. And so there's that imbalance. The rules are sort of set up to make it very difficult. Like, we're entitled to, as a tenant or as a tenant's lawyer, you're entitled to discovery in these cases, which means you can get information from the landlord. You can send document requests and say, I need a copy of my rent ledger, and they're required to produce it within the rules of professional conduct, say, I think 60 days for document request. Well, as I said, you could be at trial in 3 weeks. So you need a judge to be pretty forgiving with deadlines and continuances and grant, you know, give you the time to get that discovery, and they're not always going to do it. So basically what I'm trying to say is the decks are stacked against the tenants throughout the process, from before the case is filed to after they're removed. So now, let's see, where should I go from there? We found in our analysis, sorry, I'm jumping around a little. We found in our analysis that people of color are about twice as likely as white people to have an eviction filed against them. And we also looked at evictions where the tenant won the case. So the outcome was that the tenant prevailed for whatever, like maybe you went to court, or say you're the tenant and you're accused of not paying your rent in September, and you show the judge your receipts, and the judge agrees with you. You did pay your rent in September, and tosses the eviction out. So you've done nothing wrong as a tenant. A court has found you did nothing wrong as a tenant. You followed the terms of your lease, but this record, will stick with you forever. You still have an eviction record. But more than, I'm sorry. My pages are not in order, and I think I just jumped ahead. 1 second. Does anyone have any questions? This is a good time to take a moment of questions. Anyone?
I'm wondering, if the map you just showed, can we access that ourselves?
Yeah, there is a URL for it. We haven't published our data really, or at least we haven't publicized it. So I can put this link in the chat.
Thanks so much. It would be great. I'm really interested in looking more deeply at especially the Hartford data.
Yeah, so I would suggest when it loads up, it'll load up with the COVID period. Essentially, it'll start from March, and then you can adjust. I'm trying to get to the chat. The March data, the March and on data, you really need to sort of have a sense of what has happened since March to be able to interpret it in terms of protections that are slowing evictions down. It's not the most convenient URL. So any other questions right now? No? Okay, so that scenario, let's go back to the scenario. You've just proven your innocence to the judge. There's no indication based on this eviction record, that you have done anything wrong as a tenant, that you are a bad tenant. Who here has applied for an apartment before? Yeah, folks have. Some folks have. So when you apply for an apartment, you typically will pay an application fee, or maybe not, but the landlord will usually do a background check, and that background check looks at it's usually done by a third-party tenant screening company that collects extensive information from your background about your credit, about your finances, about your criminal record, and about your eviction record. And many landlords, if this background check turns up any sort of eviction record, any sort of housing court record whatsoever, will reject you. I mean, that's the end of the analysis right there. Actually, tenant screening companies increasingly are offering products that will just do that for the landlord. So the landlord never will even see your eviction record or know that the reason you were rejected was your eviction record. They just get back reject, and they don't know why. But you can be rejected for that eviction record where you prevailed, and based on I guess my experience, at least, that's more common than landlords really looking at, you know, what happened in this eviction case. Did the tenant actually do anything wrong here? Landlords usually don't get to that level of analysis. They're just trying to fill that unit and fill it with someone they think is going to be a good tenant, and they think anybody who's had an eviction filed against them is a bad tenant. So that eviction case is going to follow you potentially forever. This sort of blacklist forces people into substandard housing in specific neighborhoods where landlords are willing to accept people who are not necessarily as sort of on paper as you know, credentialed to be tenants. So you end up with slumlords essentially who are the only ones with qualifications that are standards that a tenant with an eviction record can meet, and so that people end up in substandard housing. Because not just because of eviction, you see the same thing with criminal records, and you see the same sorts of racial disparities in criminal records. But this sort of screening based on eviction history perpetuates the same segregation patterns that have led to Connecticut's segregation and just reinforces what you see in Hartford. In this map of Hartford, you see people, or I guess this map doesn't have demographics of neighborhoods, but if it did, the bigger dots of evictions would also coincide with larger population of color. And Yeah, uh, the only properties you can imagine someone with an eviction record might be able to access are in the lowest income neighborhoods where nobody has the financial background or the qualifications to be able to meet a stringent background check that demands no blemishes whatsoever. Now, I'm going to stop sharing because I don't know if I shared that window or my screen. Let's see. I guess I'll jump into COVID now. So that's the eviction crisis, generally speaking. That's always there. That's the backdrop that we work within, and it's like for a tenant advocate, it's always an uphill battle. Where you saw those statistics where 6% of tenants have lawyers, 80% of landlords have lawyers, even when they don't. You know, if you haven't paid your rent, there's nothing you can do. You don't have any defenses. You're not going to win that case. And so it's always an uphill battle. COVID has really, it's affected things in certain predictable ways. So one of the predictable ways is that the quarantine led to massive job loss, and that massive job loss has led people to be incapable of paying their rent and meeting their financial obligations. And because of that, you would see huge numbers of evictions if this was a normal time. But in April, I think in April, Connecticut imposed an eviction moratorium, which basically said that except for certain exceptions, landlords cannot file new eviction cases. And even before that, the court stopped processing certain types of requests from landlords. So when a case gets to the point where a landlord can have the marshal actually put someone out of the home, that's called once the court authorizes that, that's called issuing an execution. It's a piece of paper that's called an execution. Once the court has issued it, signed it, then it can be given to a marshal, and the marshal can serve it on the tenant and actually remove them from the home. The courts halted executions, I think, in March, even before the moratorium came down. And this was all very surprising to me, because this is not the first housing crisis since I've been a lawyer. In 2009, there's the financial collapse, and the same sorts of I think the scale was a little greater here than in terms of job loss and so on than during the financial crisis. But it was the same sorts of circumstances where people just couldn't meet their housing obligations. People couldn't pay. I don't remember an eviction moratorium anywhere. I don't remember any sort of like huge pot of money for rental assistance. I don't remember anyone advocating for canceling rent or for halting evictions temporarily or permanently. All of that is also new. And that's also very exciting to me as someone who's seen activism and been excited about activism throughout my life, but I've never seen it in housing. But now you see people advocating for and thinking about and developing creative solutions to crises that have been around forever, or at least since our economic system has been around. And yeah, so I'll finish walking through the protections, and then I'll talk a little bit more about those efforts. Well, so Connecticut imposed that moratorium that in April that said landlords can't file new eviction cases except for what's called serious nuisance. And serious nuisance is just a legal term that means potential threat to health or safety or property. So there's, I think there's actually like a longer specific definition in the statute. And so that was the only type of eviction that could be filed. Let's share the map and look at what happens to the numbers if we change the dates. So let's start in March 11th. That's, no, 2020. I think that was the last day I went to work. Also my last day of sanity because I went to work at home with a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old also at home, which was not easy. 5-year-old is still home. Let's see. Where should we end today? Come on. I want to. So you've got 260. You would expect over that period of time to see roughly 10,000 in the state. So in total, I think I don't know what the total count is. I don't know if it says a year. But it's, it's nowhere near what you'd expect in a normal year. So if you look at the eviction lab, I mentioned earlier their COVID tracker, and if you look at Hartford and Bridgeport on their COVID tracker, you'll see that I think it says that the racial disparity or the eviction rate among white people has actually increased more than the eviction rate among people of color, which is a surprising result until you realize that it's based largely on location. And in some of these towns, you've got maybe one eviction filed in a year, in a normal year. And if that has increased to 2 or 3, then you've got in that town a 300% jump in a white town. So it's tripled. Whereas if Hartford gets 1,000 more evictions or in a normal year, it's barely 50%. I don't even think it's 50% of Hartford's evictions. It might be a relatively modest increase among white people that just looks like year over year, it's a massive jump in the eviction rate for white people, or a larger jump for white people than people of color. That's one sort of caveat about the information. Another is that with all these protections in place, you can't tell from an eviction filing the scale of the, I guess, the crisis. You can't tell who is at imminent risk, who is going to have an eviction filed against them the day after these moratoriums expire, because their landlords aren't dumb enough to file an eviction during the moratorium, pay a filing fee, and then have it promptly dismissed by the court. So what you see here is a map of a specific type of case, the serious nuisance cases that courts have allowed filing, and dumb landlords who either didn't know or didn't care that there was a moratorium in effect that didn't allow them to file these cases. Other than that, this particular map or these numbers don't give you a whole lot of information about what's going on and what you should expect. Ananya mentioned some of the studies and analyses that attempt to estimate the sort of anxiety and the situation, the renter burden and situation generally right now, and what the housing instability, what they expect to happen once landlords can file evictions again. Nobody really knows for sure, but it's likely to be on the order of, I don't know how many evictions will actually be filed, but the number of households that are behind on rent and could have evictions filed is certainly in the hundreds of thousands in Connecticut. I don't know exactly how many. I've seen estimates that put it at 100, 150,000, and I've seen higher estimates than that.
What's the total number of households in Connecticut?
Renter or total?
Total or renter? I mean, total's probably a good enough thing to measure against.
1,300,000.
And that 100,000 is just in Connecticut, so it's like more than 10% of total households in Connecticut.
The estimates I've seen put it in the hundreds of thousands in Connecticut. Yes, and I think the ones that are in the low hundreds of thousands I remember seeing early on, like months ago. So I don't know exactly what, there was a point when we were trying to do this, when we were trying to estimate how many, it was when the state was considering or first developing the rental assistance program that actually provided rent money. And I'll get into sort of what the parameters of that program were and some of the problems were. But generally, we were trying to advocate for a much larger pot of money than the 10 million they ended up with. And we were just trying to estimate the number of households. And there are just so many assumptions that you're making and so many, and I feel like someone who's a lot smarter and can take into account a lot more variables than I'm capable of taking into account needs to do that type of thing. But where they landed in Connecticut was a pot of $10 million that they thought would be sufficient to address the rent needs. That was $10 million for rent money to assist tenants, and it would go to landlords. They have distributed. The program is closed. It's shuttered. Actually, no. I don't know if they technically are reopening a different program or just putting more money into it. But they shuttered this program a few weeks ago with something like 7,000 applications, having actually assisted two families. Two families had their rent paid, and other than that, I don't know how many. It was a couple thousand, I think, whose applications were approved. But the state interpreted this as a sign that maybe the scale of the problem is not that great, and they put in another $15 million. But really, the only reason these numbers were so goddamn low is because they designed these numbers in terms of applications and approved applications, et cetera, because they designed the program with way too many qualifications. It's way too confusing. Their call center didn't have enough people, so people couldn't actually get through. And the sad thing is that this program has been significantly more useful than the undocumented housing assistance program, which has not provided any assistance to any families. and undocumented folks were left out of this one. This program is called, the acronym is TRAP because that's what it does to you. But I don't remember, Temporary Rental Housing Assistance Program. So they've re-upped that. The moratorium has been extended. The Connecticut moratorium has been extended. It was supposed to expire in August, then October 1st, then last week or even this week, maybe. Lamont extended it through the end of the year with some additional terms, but vaguely the same. And the CDC also issued its moratorium, which I'm sure everybody heard about. But basically that one prohibits taking any sort of action on to evict somebody who for non-payment of rent. So, but it doesn't prohibit any other basis. There are arguments about whether someone can be evicted under the CDC order for no reason, like just because your lease has expired and the landlord just doesn't want you there anymore. So in my opinion, the CDC order does not authorize that sort of eviction. So if somebody is otherwise eligible for the protections of the CDC order, they shouldn't be evicted for no reason. But that's up to a court whether they would buy that argument. And so the CDC order, the relationship between the CDC order and the Connecticut order, the moratorium is, they're sort of in addition to each other. A tenant can avail themselves of either or both. The Connecticut one, for someone without an eviction filed against them, offers essentially the same protection as like if it's a non-payment of rent issue, you could give the landlord a CDC declaration, the form that you need to give the landlord to take advantage of the CDC protection. But the Connecticut one should be enough to prohibit that landlord from filing a case against you for non-payment. For someone who had an eviction case filed against them already before these moratoriums took effect, the CDC order would halt the processing of that eviction, whereas Connecticut's moratorium doesn't say anything about what action can be taken on existing cases that were already filed. That might be more technical than you're interested in, but that's sort of the relationship between the two. So one of the things that we've been trying to do lately is, since we have this nightly updating database of eviction records, so we have a fully up-to-date database of eviction records, we've been pulling out lists of tenants and their contact information who are at specific stages of the eviction process. So basically people who are about to be removed, and we've been sending them the information that they need to either halt the eviction. So if they're eligible for the CDC order, there have been advocates who have been taking these lists of tenants who are about to have an execution issued, and sending them letters saying these are the things you need to do to halt that process right now. I think that's been tremendously effective. But the thing that's really exciting to me, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is the bigger demands that people are making and the bigger ways that people are thinking about what's possible in housing. So not just sort of like there's basic stuff like in some places. There have been efforts to turn rent into just a consumer debt, so you can be sued for it for not paying rent, and a debt collector can show up, but you can't be sort of forcibly removed from your home, dispossessed, etc. Actually, there is some that arguably is a situation in Connecticut right now, because you can be sued for back rent, but you just can't be evicted with the moratorium in effect. So that is sort of tepid move, but it's still new. I haven't seen any sort of changes like that since I've been a lawyer in the past 10 years. But even more than that, as I said already, I've never seen a moratorium. I've never seen a huge pot of money created for emergency rental assistance. Basically, I've never seen tenants' rights or renters' rights talked about or thought about. But cancel rent as a demand, and the discussions around what that means and the proposals that have been developed, I think have pushed the envelope forward in terms of what's possible. I think, yeah, I would love to see a move in the US away from sort of commercialized for-profit housing and toward there are various models, cooperative ownership, or whatever model people come up with. I would love to see just pushes to decommodify housing and to make sure that it's treated as a basic human right. So much of our financial, emotional, physical stability and health comes from having a place to live, having a safe, affordable, decent place to live. If you don't have a place to live, it's going to be hard to apply for a job. Think about where are you going to get your letters from your potential employer? You got to, every burden becomes significantly more challenging if you don't have a decent place to live, on top of just the health effects of not having a home, a decent home, the effects on children, the effects on education. I mean, name it. It will impact your life. Eviction can permanently destabilize a life, and so in this world, especially in a world where at the snap of a finger, there can be an order that everybody must stay home. In that kind of a world, we need to be thinking about how we ensure that people with fewer resources are able to access the basic things they need. And people are thinking about it in housing for the first time, at least in my adult life, which is very exciting. So I think this is till 1:45?
Yeah, 1:45, 1:50.
Okay. So do folks have questions, or would you like me to just keep rambling? And I would love it if you have questions, because I don't want to keep rambling.
I have a question. So you mentioned a couple of times about the financial crisis around 2009 and how there really wasn't this kind of moratorium or rent cancellation, but there is now. Would you say that's primarily because of or advocacy for tenant rights, or is it also because the nature of the pandemic where you kind of have to stay home, that's just what's needed from everyone to keep everyone safe?
So you said, was that primarily because of something? And I didn't hear that.
Advocacy for tenants' rights.
I think it's both. I honestly don't know. Oh, now I can hear my echo. I honestly don't know what factor brought this to fruition. I think there were years of advocacy that certainly had an effect. Like, people have been forming tenants unions and working on tenants issues around the country for years. But generally it's been in small pockets here and there, or it's been on listservs among advocates. It's never been visible. I don't know what it is. I think that's part of it, but it also seems like, I'm trying to think back to March, and seems like within a couple weeks of this crisis starting, there were already people in government thinking about and talking about eviction moratoriums. And like I said, in the last financial crisis, I don't remember that ever coming into the discussion. I don't remember being a possibility that you're going to halt all evictions. Although they did establish protections for homeowners from foreclosure. I'm not the person to ask about the contours of those protections, but they definitely left out renters. I don't know. That's the answer. Do you have a theory?
I have no idea. I was curious because it's some of the stuff that I know I've heard in a lot of conversations has been that, you know, this is a time where we are forced to are asked to stay home as far as possible to keep ourselves safe, keep our families safe, and avoid contact as much as possible. And the kind of unfairness of the situation really comes up because not everyone is able to, you lose your job, you can't pay rent, you don't have somewhere to isolate yourself and quarantine yourself. So it's kind of like the health risk is entangled with the housing instability. And so I was just wondering whether maybe there's been more, I don't know if it's appropriate to say leniency with allowing people to, I guess, canceling rent for people just for the sake of okay, just stay home, whatever it takes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably a big part of it. I think not only sort of the health, the actual health angle of it, where you don't want people forcibly displaced during a global pandemic. You don't want people moving. You want people safe and isolated and distant, etc. But on top of that, there are emergency powers that the government has on account of it being a pandemic. So now you don't need to get, a majority of the legislature and the governor's office and everybody else to agree on language for legislation that would halt evictions. You just need to convince whoever that emergency authority is, who can declare evictions halted temporarily, to use their public health power, emergency power, to do this. I mean, you certainly wouldn't see the CDC doing something like this unless there's an ongoing public health emergency. So I think the health aspect both creates an argument in support of halting evictions and also gives the power to make these emergency proclamations.
Thanks, Salman. I have a lot of questions, but I'll restrict myself to one for right now. In talking about the decommodification of housing and more long-term solutions, I'm wondering if you could comment on, in Connecticut, or maybe just generally, I think it seems like a lot of times the solution to needing more affordable housing is to build more affordable housing. But building new affordable housing, especially outside of Connecticut cities, has a lot of resistance. And so I'm wondering, is the solution, is building a counterproductive solution, building more units, or is there actually a need for more units to get built in order to solve long-term affordability issues?
I think you need kind of a range of solutions. I think having affordable units outside of cities, in addition to just expanding the total number of affordable units available to people who need them, it also creates the opportunity for people to actually move into towns where that were previously cost prohibitive. So, you know, it's hard for a low-income family to move to Simsbury without housing assistance or without affordable housing complexes there to choose from, or any real multifamily housing. But yeah, it would be great to expand the crop of affordable housing both inside and outside cities. You could also do, I mean, there are many solutions. There's plenty of vacant property in the US that can be repurposed. There's vacant property that people own that can be taken and repurposed, and is often in better condition than, you know, sort of the dilapidated vacant warehouse that we often think of when we think of vacant property. But, you know, maybe there should be limits on the number of homes people can own. Maybe there should, there are just like, there are ways you can think about property and real estate and the distribution of resources that I think we've only scratched the surface of thinking about. So I think we need to build more, but we also need to think seriously about whether we're doing the right things with the buildings we have.
Does anyone have a last question? If not, I have a last question, so I can just ask it. This is one of the questions that someone else on our e-board sent in because she couldn't be here, but the question is, what are the long-term implications for the way housing is handled, and is the idea of having landlords inherently damaging to the creation of equity in housing? And should we create new systems, or is it more advisable to make adjustments to our present system?
I mean, kind of along the lines of what we were just talking about, but my own thinking about this question, not just in this area, but generally speaking, is that we need to make whatever reforms and improvements we can find to the existing system, while also working toward transforming it in a way that really redistributes in a meaningful way and doesn't just tweak at the edges of a deeply unfair and unequal system. But I am not ever going to reject a modest housing reform that will actually concretely improve people's lives, because I want to bring down the house in the long term. I would like to see people just work on improving things for low-income renters in particular, but for everybody. But those were great questions. Thank you. And thanks for having me. This was fun.
We appreciate it a lot. And yeah, I hope everyone had a good time and had like an informative session here. I did, so I'm happy about it.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I will keep you posted on our next event. And thank you, Salman, for coming. I very much appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.